Chapter 6. Kira shivered slightly as a cold air bit past her, and she slowly trudged on home, sadly. She received a few greetings on her way, but she didn't reply to any of them, instead remaining in her own world. When she did get home, she was met with the table that had brought so much life to this building she called home. It would have to be returned. Though she noticed a book atop of it, which resembled Colin's sketchbook, though it clearly had a different colored cover. She hurried over to retrieve it, thinking first to run and return it, but she quickly noticed the note beside it, with scribbled words upon it. Kira, you'll make this world your own, and when you do, you'll have this to remind you of home. Colin. She peered at the note for the longest time before slowly opening up the cover, revealing a beautifully sketched page of her home. Unlike everything she'd seen him sketch, this picture actually had been colored, very clearly in the same colors of Teldrassil, hued a shade of pinkish purple. Kira smiled as she flipped through, seeing Tyronis tending to a sapling, 2 night elf children, perhaps the only 2 on the tree, running through the forest, a pair of furbolgs debating, or more likely just staring at one another. His visit had been transcribed into this book, in pictures. She came to the final page, pausing, her smile disappearing as her eyes widened. There stood herself, bathing in the moonwell from the first morning of his trip. Her eyes followed the contoured inches of her body, seeing what Colin had seen and how much of it he'd remembered to transcribe, although her pose may have been a tad more seductive than she had remembered. She stared at the picture for what seemed like forever, almost studying it, although she was truly studying the artist behind it. Quickly, however, she shuddered as she heard footsteps behind her, turning to see a superior of hers stepping into her home carefully. Kira hastily turned to salute her, though the older woman waved her down. Remain calm, she ordered. We know Tyrael was responsible for this, though we still need you to answer some questions. It's not as if a human being here is tragic, though the methods used are disconcerting. Kira nodded in understanding before her superior waved her along to follow behind her, which she did. Kira stood across the room from Sylvia, simply remaining silent, though she was still nervous. Sylvia always did this, probably to make her guests sweat a little, but Kira simply used it as a time to recollect her memories of the last few days. Sylvia began writing into a thin book, perhaps to keep notes as she began writing. Speaking. So, we've already questioned Tyrael. She doesn't seem to believe she's done much wrong, and considering her status, I'm sure it will come to pass that she hasn't done anything wrong, at least in the eyes of the priestesses. The human has already left, and Colin, Kira corrected, surprising even herself. Sylvia lifted her head slightly, just to peer over towards Kira with the slightest hint of upturned eyes. Yes. Colin has already left. I'd have detained him for questioning otherwise. Sylvia spoke, scribbling feverishly across the pages of the notebook. Who is he exactly? Without thinking, Colin began speaking. A human, with a knack for artistry. He has deep blue eyes and a charming smile, short hair and nicely broad shoulders. His hands are pleasantly cool to the touch, and when he laughs, he does this sort of halting laugh that's very... Sylvia stared up at her again, barely lifting her head, though her eyes were piercing. I wasn't talking about his looks. Despite the color of her skin, Kira visibly blushed as she realized her faux pas. Yes, he's just an explorer. He studies other cultures. Skeptically, Sylvia returned her eyes to the notebook. And he was involved in the death of Dalvin? Absolutely not, Kira shouted heatedly, surprising even herself again. He went with me when we found him, but he wouldn't dare do such a thing. He couldn't have. Her superior dropped her writing utensil and stood up coolly. And am I to believe that you're separating fact from emotion when it comes to that assessment? Understanding what was being implied, Kira was taken back. I wouldn't dream of jeopardizing everything I've accomplished, much less for a mortal human, especially one who does not revere our mother. In her flagrant reply, Kira quickly noticed that she may have spoken too much as Sylvia stared at her angrily. You allowed someone here who insulted Elune upon the very crown that she has given us? Silently, Kira lowered her head. Sylvia was quite the devout follower of her goddess, which was why she had ascended the ranks quickly enough. She was more heated than Kira had ever seen her before, but it immediately was cloaked behind a bow as Kira noticed somebody entering the small enclave of her room. Tyrande. Kira? She asked curiously. What brings you here? Feeling at odds, she didn't reply, expecting her superior to do so for her, but as though to punish her, no such answering occurred, leaving Kira alone to appear belligerent. Is this about the human who came to visit upon false circumstances? Tyrande questioned, now looking at her lieutenant. Yes, sister, Sylvia replied, though you speak in such mild terms. Tyrande walked over towards the desk where Sylvia sat, turning to look at Kira. Sister, Kira, Could it be that you unknowingly allowed this, simply so as to leave the Sentinels? Shocked, Kira shouted. Of course not! I've given my life to the priestesses of Elune. If my mother and my sisters requested, I would remain here for... She paused, which she found odd. She had the entire sentence on her tongue, but at the last second it just vaporized. Tyrande smirked quietly, watching Kira's head lower once again, joining her shaking shoulders. Silently, Tyrande strode breathlessly over towards Kira, wrapping her arms around her in a hug. Go. I know that you've wanted it for so long, and despite whatever needs we may need from you, you deserve it. Kira's head shot upward to watch Tyrande's face, shocked as the head priestess continued, If you hurry, you may yet catch him. But, Kira muttered, Nah, Tyrande sounded, interrupting her. Elune has something special in mind for you, apart from our home, and also for that human, I know. So go, and make us proud. Kira's cheeks were now full of starlight as a grin reached across her face as she quickly returned the hug before rushing out from the small room, leaving the other two alone. Sylvia sat down, sighing. You know she deserves some sort of reprehension. Turning slowly, Tyrande shrugged. Perhaps, but those two will do great things. Why impede it any more than it already has been? Now, send for Tyrael and let her know. I know she was particularly fond of that girl. Sylvia groaned, but agreed nonetheless. Colin leaned against the railing of the massive boat, staring out into the distance. He'd made it down to the docks of Route Therin, thanks to Tyrael, and now only awaited departure, or capture, perhaps. He lowered his head, thinking about Kira fondly, saddened that they had to be parted prematurely. He knew it wasn't meant to be anything else, but his heart still tugged at the thought. The sailors behind him quickly prepared to shove off, their feet constantly thumping to and fro as they ran about, non-stop. Apparently there was a storm off the coast of Kalimdor, and all hands were needed on deck. Colin figured that Tyrael simply ordered them not to wait in order to get him gone as soon as possible, and as such he felt a bit guilty, knowing he'd be sent down into the hold once they got into the storm. The boat began to leave the dock as Colin overheard the shouting of people in Darnassian, some of which seemed angry enough to be vulgar, and he lowered his head to see the rippling of the ocean water beneath him, his eyes squinting painfully. And we're off, he muttered to himself, as though needing to in order to truly realize that he was leaving. As he began to straighten up, he heard the whining of a hippogriff, forcing him to look back towards land. Astounded, his eyes grew wide as he watched Kira climbing onto the back of one, grappling at its reins and tugging mightily to get it to fly up. Colin was shocked to see her coming his way, towards the boat, and he quickly ran to the center of the deck to watch her as she struggled to control the beast, which seemed rather belligerent to begin with. She came close enough to being above the boat when the hippogriff suddenly bucked her off, sending her flying towards the deck. Colin hurried across to the port, reading her trajectory, and he did manage to find her, though at her speed she more so flew into him, knocking the wind out of him. They flew back, sliding into the wall of the hold, Colin desperately trying to take a breath. Kira quickly pulled away from him and examined him, ultimately resorting to simply holding his shoulder as if to console him. Sorry, she spoke. Damn things never did like me much. Colin continued gasping for air as he tried to talk, but it was unsuccessful, and he ultimately pointed at her and shrugged. Kira grinned in reply. I'm coming with you. Now, Colin's gasps became coughs as he held his torso in pain. What? Kira's grin remained. They don't want me out in the world, so Tyrande relieved me of duty. I'm coming with you. But you've worked your whole life to find my place in this world, she finished. And if you've taught me anything, it's that it's not here. It's somewhere else in this world. I'll never find it if I don't go look. Colin continued staring at her, still holding his stomach as he sat against the wooded paneling, long enough in silence for Kira to continue. Unless you don't want company, I can go it alone. To this, Colin grinned, extending his hand. I wouldn't dream of anything else, Miss Shadowmoon. She grinned at the unabashedly human speech and took his hand in a handshake before standing to help him to his feet. They stared at one another as though they'd been apart for years before the ringing voice of a man across the deck roused them. Well, if you wanted to pick up some Darnassian, this may not be the proper place. Kira lowered her head, slightly blushing. Colin grinned, walking towards the railing once again, Kira following along. We're headed for Lord Danelle, which you wanted to go to, right? I figured if you're joining me, we could backtrack somewhat from where I've been. It'd be nice to follow up on some of my acquaintances. They'll be shocked I picked up a Teldrasilian night elf on my adventure for one. Kira smirked lightly. That voice earlier mentioned something quite the opposite. Colin turned to her, now his turn to blush, before hiding his face within the map he'd pulled out. Kira leaned over the railing herself, watching the island home of hers disappear into the distance, the first time she'd seen it do so. She felt the smallest bit of loss, but suddenly felt some release, as though it was her time to go. Colin turned and leaned his back against the railing, with Kira quickly emulating him. Their eyes found one another, and they both let themselves into childlike grins. All they knew now was that adventure was sure to await them.